Hey up and welcome to the Temple of Blair. I'm going to cut to the chase on this one because I'm sure a lot of people would be excited to get straight to the point. This is a conversation with Scott Burns, legendary death metal producer, Morris Sound aficionado, and author David Gehlke. They're talking about the book, The Scott Burns Sessions, A Life in Death Metal, 1987 to 1997, which, as I speak, I believe is now shipping. I think when we recorded this about a month or so ago, it was like in the works of being shipped through Decibel. Now I think it's going out the door, so get your act together and go and order that shit. I'll drop a link in the description and whatnot. Anyway, let's get straight to it. 1, 2, fuck shit up. The way I want to sort of tackle this is talk primarily about the book, sort of not go too much into the band details because a lot of that's covered in the book and I don't want to spoil it. And hopefully we'll just keep it very casual and have a good time, and hopefully it'll be wrapped in about 45, I think. Something like that, if that's cool.
Sounds good, Jim. Yep.
So you seem to be dominating, David, a particular period in history. Can I ask what made you start this project and what brought it to your table?
Related to Scott, you mean?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, well, it stems from the obituary book. That's how I got to know Scott really well during the obituary book. I think we spoke 3 or 4 times, and every time we spoke, it got better and better. And we quickly developed a rapport, not only because we both had a shared love of obituary and death metal, but Scott and I are aligned in many ways outside of music, whether it be politically, socially, economically, environmentally, all those things. Maybe the only difference we have is we like different sports teams. He likes the Tampa team, so the Rays, the Bucks. I live in Pittsburgh and I'm a Pirates fan, but for football, I'm a Browns fan. So I think that's where we diverge. But no, the obituary book wrapped, I think, late 2021. Scott sent me an email saying, hey, I've been thinking about doing something on my own with my friend Tim Hubbard, who has books, pictures in the obituary book. That cover that you just shared, Jim, that was Tim's work. And Scott asked me if I'd be interested in helping him put something together. And I think it took me maybe 2 seconds to say yes to do it. And I mean, it was a really easy decision to make just based on the type of person Scott was. And the original vision was just for the book to cover off on the bands that Tim took pictures of. Then you find, yeah, Tim's got a great photo archive and library, but there are way more bands that Scott did that Tim didn't happen to shoot. And then you start to do research and find out exactly how many bands Scott recorded, how many records he was a part of. Then once we got rolling, almost everyone wanted to participate because everyone said, you know, sort of the key terms there, Scott's a cool dude. He's easygoing, relaxed. I'd love to talk about Scott Burns. Like, you know, very few bands turned me down or I wasn't able to get in touch with. And it really just snowballed from there. And it tied into Scott's original request. You know, once we found out we didn't have enough pictures, Scott said, well, can you at least try and find enough bands that I've recorded? And the famous line was, I'd hate to be that guy walking down the street and run into one of the bands I recorded and them to say, hey, Scott, I see you have a book. Why is my band not in it? So that was always in my head when assembling the book, is that I wouldn't want to let Scott down by not trying to scour every nook and cranny of the internet looking for obscure bands that he recorded. We got, I mean, the end count was 69. Scott probably did ballpark probably close to 90 bands, and that's just probably based on his tenure at Morris Sound and the fact that not every band was documented that he recorded. So it was an easy call to make. Scott is an easy guy to work with. We were already friends going into the project. We became even better friends throughout. So that it's a big book, obviously, but it was fairly simple to put together when you're working with somebody who you enjoy working with. And Scott wasn't very demanding. You know, I think he just said, "Don't make me look stupid," which is really easy. It's hard to make Scott look stupid. So it came together pretty easily.
Scott, you don't usually like the limelight, though, do you? Is this been a change of heart in recent years?
No, I think like David alluded to is my buddy Tim Hubbard, the photographer. The original thing was he talked about we were having lunch one day, and he said, "Hey, about having a book and showing all the photos and maybe talking about it." And I said, "I think I'd like that because it would be nice to talk about the bands. Because, look, while the book is about me and the sessions, it really is about all the great bands. I mean, my point of view is that I was a lucky guy that happened to like extreme music, metal, rock, right guy at the right time at a great studio and with a lot of great bands around, like you said, Obituary and stuff. And as David said, we talked a bunch during the Obituary book, and I thought he was a cool guy and got to know each other better and better just from talking long sessions about John, Don, Trevor, and the band. And, and so when Tim brought it up, it became apparent to us that we don't really have the skill set. Even though Tim's got like Stiff Pole Records and stuff like that, he's done punk stuff and all that. It would be hard for us. And that's when I asked him because I trusted him. I said, "Hey, would you all be interested?" I had no idea if anybody would or not, right? Like I said, so anyway, but David said he talked to Albert, and they were cool, and they said, "Sure, we'll do a book." And like I said, that's the thing I appreciate for what David did is that he went and found all these bands. I'll be honest with you, some of these bands I did not even remember recording, and I'm sorry to say that, but I mean I recorded a hell of a lot of bands back in the day, and once I remembered them, some of them, I'm not saying all of them, but I mean, he dug through a lot of bands. Some of these were 1-day sessions, 4-hour sessions. But I never wanted anybody, like he said, to walk up to me and say, "Hey, man, why didn't you put me in the book?" Because to me, they're all equal. I had a great time. And I think the fans are the ones, the divining rod or whatever, that decide who's better or not. It's not it's not about me to say who's good or bad, right? Let everyone else decide, the fans decide. But I was just happy and lucky and humbled to be able to record them. And, picking up on our conversation before we started I was lucky too with a lot of things like Borovoy and Monty and a lot of the bands in the beginning that Dan Johnson did that gave me a shot, right? That said, "Hey, this guy's cool," right? I mean, like I said, we'll go on to it later if you want, but death metal wasn't really cool in the beginning. It was really underground. And yes, it had a following, but it wasn't the coolest thing in the world and a lot of people, especially in the recording world, weren't really into it. But that's it.
How do you remember all the stories though? Because it's the way it's structured in the book, it's almost academic, right? It's not like a long autobiographical prose. It's really well kind of arranged. It's really easy to follow. It's almost like an academic textbook for me, which sings to me a lot. So how do you remember all that?
That's
I
David.
would give Scott a lot of clues, and he would ask me to send him. What really bailed us out was YouTube, actually, because a lot of these demos found their way onto YouTube. Otherwise, Scott or I would have no way of finding them unless we hunted the bands down themselves. So Scott and I got into a very nice pattern. Once our way of working was we did all the big bands first. Like we blew through, I think the first one we did was Death. We probably spent a few weeks on Death. Then we moved through the Deicides, Suffocation. We didn't do Obituary because we already talked about Obituary for the book. So they were already done. It's the Suffocations, like I said, the Exhorters. We moved through a Cannibal. We moved through all those. And then we sort of prioritized what bands to do next. And so then we got deeper and deeper into Scott's discography. And that's when we'd find bands. A really good example is the Toronto thrash band Overthrow, who, Scott admitted, like, "I haven't listened to these guys since 1990. I can't believe how good this is." And I said that I told Scott the same thing. It's like, these guys are incredible. But before
Amazing.
Scott and I talked, yeah, they're amazing. Before Scott and I talked, I sent him the links, and that's when he's like, "Holy shit, this is amazing." And that's when all the memories started flooding back. And so, our interviews are really simple. It's like, "Scott, what do you remember about recording Overthrows Within Suffering?" And then it all started coming back to him like that. So I think simply by virtue of Scott listening to the bands, that helped jog his memory. But he's right. I mean, some of these things were like in and out, 4 hours. That was it. Band did one demo and then they fell off the face of the earth. But we managed to. Scott did a really good job of jogging his brain, and it also helped that sometimes we got responses from the bands in advance. So I would share that with Scott, and then Scott like, okay, now I remember that. So that was, it was sort of we had to puzzle it together in a way, because you're right, Jim. It's an oral history. I mean, each band is led with a paragraph put together by an intro put together by me, but really it's Scott and the bands telling the stories, and it's hard. It's hard to go back and remember something. I'm 41. I can't tell you what I was doing 30 years ago. We're asking Scott to go back and figure out things he's doing in 1988. I mean, it's hard, but I'll give him credit. He really dug into the far reaches of his brain and pulled stuff out.
No, I think we tried, David. Sure, we did. And once again, is a lot of great. There's great bands all the time, but it was a great scene back then. Bands coming up in the beginning, and like us, some bands, Overthrow. I mean, David brought up is a perfect example. Why they weren't bigger than they are, I don't know. But they were killer. And there's a lot of killer bands, and some made it and some don't. But the whole point of the book is to remember these bands. Like I said, it's okay, it's me that recorded them, but it really is about the bands and the time for somebody who grew up in that era or whatever, or who's fond of that era, to go back and look on it and say, yeah, I remember those bands, or I dug the shit out of there. I saw that band and they kicked ass, or Demolition Hammer, or fucking pick any band. I mean, Gorguts, a lot of great bands, right? Suffocation, I mean, all the big bands. But that I think David captured that, and I think that's what's important, is that it really documents a period of metal and extreme music that was a golden era, if I may say that is. And like I said, there's still great bands coming out, but it really was at the time because it was different. Times were changing from King Diamond and thrash to heavy vocals. And I'll stop but we see today is now no one talks about death metal or anything with brutal vocals. It's just metal. And that's a nice thing.
Yeah. It's sort of giving it a seat at the table as part of the lineage and the DNA where we are now. As you say, metal is just considered anything that's sort of what would have been regarded brutal back in the day. David, sort of from an objective perspective, what is so critical about this period that's like worth exploring? Why is it so culturally relevant? I'm not directly asking Scott because you've partially answered that and you lived it, so it's not fair.
Well, it's important. Yeah, Scott definitely did answer a part of that, but it's also important to note that Scott and Morris sound in general, they were so pivotal in making extreme metal sound good. Because if we go back before then, you think of how the Venom records sounded, or Bathory, or the first few Possessed albums. Even if we want to go to Scream Bloody Gore, I don't think anyone would remark to you that, wow, the production is great on those. The thrash bands all sounded better. I think we even pointed out in the book, once we got to 86 or 87, thrash started to sound pretty good. Like Master of Puppets sounded great. Rain and Blood sounded killer. Among the Living sounded awesome. So, someone or some studio needed to figure out how to make it sound good. And then once more sound became that place, that was the template, that was the barometer for everybody else. So the work that the production methods that Jim and Tom Morris started, then Scott would help perfect. I mean, it was crucial. Think about the drums. Prior to that, drums were always buried. You could never make out the kick drums. The snare was always uneven. And that stuff drove Scott nuts. And so, he would always come in and say, all right, we got to get the drums to sound good. And Scott, there's a lot of stories of Scott being a master at tuning drums and getting drums to sound good and triggering and all those things. All those things are so commonplace now, and it touches on what Scott just said. Death metal is now just metal, but good production now is like it's almost a guarantee, right? Almost everyone there's almost no excuse now for a band not to have a good sounding record. But back then, circa 1990, you needed a good studio and you needed a good producer like Scott. Otherwise, you're going to sound like garbage, and Monty Connor's not going to sign you to Roadrunner. Brian Slagle's not going to care about you. all these things. So that was Morrisound and Scott are really were the purveyors of getting extreme metal. They laid the groundwork for how extreme metal is today.
I think,
What real 10 seconds, and Dan Johnson, to throw him in there, the Sabotage records, the early Nasty Savage records, Slagle's, look, like I said, they were a band incredible, and Jim did them incredible. But the vocals, right, more of the King Diamond style, but the riffing, they were brutal as fuck. But like he said, is a lot of studios did not care about metal, and Dan had Damage, he had Crimson Glory, he had Sabotage. It was a big influence, and Jim and Tom with their techniques. But it was hard back then to record, and the stuff I did or the thrash bands, it was hard, as he said, with all those records to record fast stuff and get clarity of it. And I think the thing is a lot of engineers just were not scared of it, but just were like, this is supposed to sound bad, right? Or it's not supposed to sound good. And the other thing is David alluded to was the technology nowadays is everybody could fucking sample everything and fly it in seconds. It was harder back then, but to get the drums to sound good, it was work. But it sounded so heavy. You know what I mean? It was nice. So
I think this point about Morrisound yourself, Scott, this turning point where there's a legitimization of this extreme outlier. I think this outlier genre, it can't be stressed enough, but I'm trying to think of different ways to articulate it so we can visualize why it's important. And I always sort of just go off onto little different tangents. And David, you mentioned something there that, if there wasn't a Morrisound, maybe there wasn't Glenn Benton's layered vocals being articulated and engineered to a point of quality, and maybe Monty didn't sign him, and then maybe Brian wasn't interested, and maybe Borovoy, if Three Cherries was still around at that point. I think it's Three Cherries. If they wouldn't have been interested. There's a whole ripple effect. There's a whole thing. And I think part of the Roadrunner, and I can always bring it back to the Roadrunner documentary because I'm trying to obviously pull this thing together, but the whole point is, I believe that you take your favorite band in the entire world, there's probably 20 bands better than that band, but you'll never hear about them because Morrisound didn't happen or an equivalent didn't happen and it fell through the net. That's the point. There's a parallel universe out there where Morrisound didn't exist and it all happened in Canada and death metal sounds completely different in 2023 as a result. That's why it's important to me. And that's why I'm just trying to regurgitate different ways of saying it, because I think that's why it's critically important. If we didn't have Morrisound, maybe Joey Jordison wouldn't have that similar influence on his drum sound. Therefore, Slipknot doesn't happen in the same way. Blah, 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 blah. I think it's quite a delicate timeline of events which Morrisound and Scott have sort of inserted themselves into. Is that feeling resonant?
It's sort of like your Back to the Future 2 comparison there, right? Is that what you're getting at? I think
am I burying myself into a hole here, or am I arriving at a consensus possibly?
I think you make sense because Morrisound was just the right place at the right time. It's Scott, Jim and Tom, and Dan Johnson, as you mentioned, were the right producers at the right time. And you're right. You mentioned a guy like Joey Jordison or the next wave of death metal bands. They were all teenagers when Scott was producing. So these were the guys. I think of the dude from Volbeat, Michael Paulson, who's a huge death metal guy. He was of that age bracket when Scott and Morrisound were around. So they were being influenced by those records. So yeah, that next generation, there was a lull, and Scott talks about it a lot, and we talk about it a lot in the book that happened in the mid to late 90s. But once we got past that into the 2000s, then you had your Slipknots and Volbeat's obviously not death metal, but we know Michael Paulson's in death metal. But all the next wave of bands, the Cattle Decapitations and things like that. That's a result of Morrisound.
Yeah, but there were. Just to chime in, is sure Morrisound was influential. I agree, but Skolsberg over in
Sunlight
in Europe and stuff. There were bands. Colin was doing a good job, but I think in general is that the biggest thing is that there was a perception of metal that you had to be this proper form of metal, right? Like I said, Anthrax, I mean, you were mentioning earlier, Jeff Waters, Annihilator. They were a huge Roadrunner band, right? King Diamond. So even though the bands that I was doing for them were doing well and had a following, they were nothing like the Anthraxes, the Slayers, the Metallicas, the Megadeths, Testaments, Nuclear Assault. I mean, blah, blah, blah. We can go through the whole thing is. And I think the attitude at the time within the record industry was this is proper metal, or this is the future of metal, and this is just some kids having fun. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but I don't think anyone thought anything that this was more than a passing phase that ended up being more of an influential wave of metal. So I think that influenced the recording is because most engineers, you had to, I'll say this, if I can say one thing about myself is I was young enough to appreciate it, right? Yeah. I didn't get it all, to be honest with you. I came from a more punk background. I listened to metal when I was a kid, Rainbow, everything, Black Sabbath, but Thin Lizzy, you name it, UFO, I loved them, Rush, everything. But when punk came around, I really liked it. And I think for a lot of older engineers it was too fast, it was too heavy. And so I think that was a big influence on them. So that, in other words, like you're mentioning these guys, future engineers and stuff, is by then, like I said, it's my Tiger Woods analogy. Now everybody's seen one good golfer. Now they all say, I know. The big thing is back in the day is we were just all fucking figuring it out. We didn't have a fucking clue what we were doing. We were just trying to make it sound as good as we can. Nowadays, like you said, David mentioned Cattle. All these guys in these bands, they know the drill. They got plugins. They know everything. They know what sounds heavy. There is no excuse for a fast band to sound bad nowadays, unless you choose to. So, but because they've got experience behind it. But anyway, that's just progression, and that's awesome.
This is what I like about learning more about you, Scott, because as a fan, when you approach a piece of information about the culture, it's immediately put on a pedestal. And the closer we get to you, Scott, the quicker we kind of learn that you're a problem solver, right? That's the key ingredient to what you brought. We've got this sound. It's a messy sound. It needs to sound good. Right, okay, what are our resources and what can we do? And that's what leads us to, say, triggering the kick drums when there's, to lay off any sloppiness. Let's really think about the guitar tone. It's a problem-solving campaign, for lack of a better term, rather than everything it was all about the evil. It was all about the grit. It was all, no, we got an assignment. We were paid to do this record, and it just sounded like this, and we needed to curate it and make it sound professional. Problem solving.
Yeah, and you also have to remember Scott had a week to do these records on a $5,000 budget, and he has Monty Connor calling him every other day in the studio saying, hey Scott, these suffocation mixes don't sound so hot. Can we do something about it? Hey Scott, what's up with the Hoffman's guitar tone? Can't we do something about it? Think of the pressure Scott was under to get all those things done. And then the fact that he worked 14, 16-hour days over time to get these records done in that time, which is just remarkable. And we left a lot of stuff on the cutting floor of guys who just couldn't hang, right? Like guys who couldn't play their parts and were very sloppy, but I think out of respect to them, we didn't go that far into the book. So Scott dealt with that a lot. He dealt with dudes who just couldn't play, sloppy. And Scott brought this up a lot. Most bands at the time were only used to hearing themselves in a very noisy rehearsal room or on stage where they can't articulate anything. Well, once they're put under the microscope at more sound, Scott says, all right, the metaphor is saying, let me take a look under the hood, and let me look at your amps and pickups. And bands would walk in sometimes to record with Scott and they'd be unprepared or they just couldn't play their parts. So it was up to Scott. He has a week to do it and he's got to figure it out. And more often than not, he did.
Yeah, no, it's I said that's true, David. And we talked about that at length, and that's 100% correct. But to throw in there just to make sure for the outsider is the bands always made, I would say something and the bands would come to an agreement, right? I mean, once again, is that they knew too who was playing well and who wasn't playing well. And as we've said previously, is that the greater the band was, the more that they focused on trying to make a great record and trying to make it sound good. Because back to what you were saying, Jim, is the one thing that was important for us is, and this is probably why I left, like on the punk side of things, is that, the sloppiness and all bothered me. I've told David one of my favorite bands is Steely Dan, and people will say, "Well, how the fuck can you like Steely Dan and Suffocation, or Cannibal Corpse, or whatever?" But I appreciate bands that go into make a record and it sounds well. At the same time, as I appreciate punk rock and brutality, so I think there's a happy medium, and to me, that's why punk rock kind of left me. That I loved about the death metal guys was the technicality of it, and that all the guys they like to see who could really play, and they like to listen. You know what I mean? That was the thing with the drum sounds was see who's really playing, who's not cheating, etc. David and I go over that a lot in the book. But so like I said, is I think these guys all, even though some guys didn't play some part, some guys did, but the band was the one that made the decision because they realized after hearing themselves under a microscope, as David said, is, hey, you know what I mean? Let's make a great record, right? We can go practice before the tour and whatever and do that, but we only got one shot and we got a weekend here.
Yeah. Something you mentioned, David, was leading to that. Obviously, there's some things you would have left on the cutting room floor. What else how many bands do you say that you couldn't get in touch with? About 21-ish? Is there anything else that you've in all of this? Yeah.
It's actually not so much down to bands, it's people that Scott and I were more hung up on. And the one guy we tried desperately to get was Chris Barnes I know he's not a Roadrunner band, but Chris Barnes, we tried every angle to get him to do the book. I mean, Albert tried to help too. And he, relations are probably not at a good spot right now between him and the Cannibal Camp. So there was that one. Jim, I don't know if you've spoken with him for your documentary, but Colin Richardson's a guy we couldn't get either, no. So yeah, Monty said Colin's not a guy to go on the record very much, and that's just not his cup of tea. But there was a sort of rivalry there, between Thomas Scotsburg, who Scott brought up earlier over at Sunlight, and Colin, and then you could throw Dan Swano into the mix too. Those were sort of like the big four of the extreme metal producers of the time, and there's some good stories in there of Colin coming over and working with Scott, and the situation being a little tense at the time. It would have been great to get Colin's perspective on that. But no, I mean, outside of that, we got just about everyone we wanted. The one person I really wanted to do a follow-up interview with was Glenn Benton, but they were on tour and doing all sorts of things. I talked to Glenn for a while at first, and he coined that infamous line, which really set the tone for the book, was, Scott Burns is a guy I could trust with my wallet. If Glenn Benton says that, I think that speaks volumes about somebody. But no, I mean, we didn't leave that much out, actually. And the book is 480 pages, so we did our darndest to get everybody, and who knows, maybe there'll be a second edition of this, and Scott and I have to do it all over again. But no, we were very fortunate that was the cool thing about the book, is I would reach out to a band, whether it was a bigger band, we can go back to Cannibal. Those guys were all over talking to Scott. They just love Scott, whether it's Corpse Grinder, or Brownie, Scott used to call him, or Alex, Paul, the main Rob Barrett, Scott's favorite guitar player. They were all over it, so that made it really easy to do. So that, and then when you get down to the bands that were maybe a little bit more obscure, they were all into it too. It's like, oh yeah, we loved working with Scott, so that made my job sort of easy. So we got really lucky. Yes, a few people left out, but for the most part, we got who we wanted.
Are there any lessons from the obituary book that you had to carry over? Because in terms of scale, you're not dealing with just one set of dudes. It's like much, much, much bigger. So is there anything you had to amend?
I had experience doing a bigger book before, because my first book was about Noise Records, And that was actually longer than Scott's book, but that's sort of misleading because the publisher asked me to do like Noise's discography, like everything Noise did, and I think that added to the page length. But that was sort of a similar project because you're dealing with multiple bands and people, so that sort of prepared me. Granted, that was 6 or 7 years ago. So the nice thing was, I mean, we went right from the obituary book into Scott's book, so I was in full Floridian death metal mode. I did not need to be educated on anyone or anything. A lot of the contacts I made during the obituary book were really easy just to carry over. Like I could think of someone like Steve DiGiorgio, for instance, who played with obituary for a quick tour and is really good friends with Scott. I mean, he was a huge help for the book, and I made friends with him during the obituary book. But for Scott's book, we spoke 4 or 5 times. I actually just spoke to him last week about something else. But I mean, Steve became a friend, so that the obituary book was just a perfect segue into Scott's book.
No, I totally understand that. I mean, when I read the intro and you said it was something like 100 and so interviews over 18 months, I was like, oh my God, what? Oh my God.
So that's why it's weird being interviewed.
3 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it helps having a deadline. Decibel and Albert established a deadline for it, and you sort of just back your way into that. And Scott and I were really consistent. There were very few times where we had to cancel. Or I think we always, coincidentally, Jim, we always spoke at this time every Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So Scott's in Florida, and I'm up here in Pittsburgh, so we're in the same time zone, and it was like clockwork, and it's something we both look forward to. And you just have to chip away at it. A book of this size, you just go bit by bit. Sometimes we had to go back over bands. Sometimes there's a thing that Scott remembered or something someone brought up, so we'd have to go back over things. But like we said at the beginning, when you're working with someone who is gracious and nice and polite as Scott, that makes your job really easy as a writer.
Yeah.
I just hope all the band, once again, is the real thing that David captured is, I hope that the fans, all the people that lived through it, that love those albums, that it brings back good memories, right? Because it was a great time, right? And it's nice to see some of the bands are still around, but I hope it brings back good memories for all the fans because it was a great time. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It was fun.
Never see something like it again. Yep.
Well, right. Not, maybe, but
Probably
it was
not.
fun.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Great.
Definitely. Okay, Scott, I've got a few questions for you which sort of fall outside the scope of the book directly because I didn't want to ask for stories which are going to be in the book, so I tried to keep it a little bit left of field. So
no problem.
You start out in live sound. What got you into that?
Well, like we talk about it in the book, is I played trombone from when I was a kid in concert band, school band, all that good stuff. So I had musical background. Like punk rock came around. My friends kind of had like a punk rock old wave band this is when I was like 18, graduated high school, and they needed a sound man. And they had a PA, and the guitarist knew how to do it. And David talks about it. We talk about it in the book. And he said, "Hey, you want to do sound?" I was like, "Sure." So he taught me how to do sound, and I loved it. I thought it was fun. And but I hated live sound, particularly. Not hated it, but it was always a battle every time because the room sounded different. We won a recording contract, won some battle of the bands, got to do a song. It was a studio. It was crappy in Tampa. And I said, there's got to be a better studio than this. And voila, after going to a bunch of studios, I met Jim, Tom, and Rick Miller at Morrisound. And then just started doing it. And I just loved, I love music. Like David and I talked one day. We both had like 10,000 records in our collection. I mean, we liked music, right? We're kids that like you probably, Jim, just love music. And I like to, so I started working at Morrisound as an assistant, and the rest is history. But I just liked music. That was it. And I liked rock and roll. I mean, heavy rock and roll, anything with guitars, bass, and drums. And anything left of the dial, weird, non-pop, I liked it. So I was a good fit, I guess.
During I mean, just going back onto the live sound bit, this isn't like these days where you can save your scenes and you can have all the faders are going to be preset to the band and things. This was a completely different era. Did you ever have like a complete absolute fucking nightmare moment with a live act?
Absolutely. Our band got hired to do sound because we had like one of the better punk rock or post rock PAs in the Tampa Bay area. We did a show at the Cuban Club. Tony and Dave of No Clubs Productions, who I love, Tony, Dave, they're still around. They hired us to do the circle jerks. So we set up the PA. Our PA was good for maybe 100, 200 people. The circle jerks probably brought in 1,000 people. You couldn't hear shit. I remember the singer coming up to me afterwards saying, "You guys fucking suck." And I was like, "Well, I'm sorry, buddy. What can I fucking do? You guys are huge and we have a little PA." It was the utmost disaster of the world. The only time you could hear anything was when he talked in between songs. And they were so pissed off. But, it was punk rock in 1983. So, I mean, you win some, you lose some.
So when something like that happens, man, I equate it to bombing for a stand-up. There's the feeling, that sinking feeling. Once it happens like 2 or 3 times or something like that, then you just go, "Oh, fuck it, it's cool."
Right.
Tomorrow's always another day.
Yeah, tomorrow's another day, but like you said, is after the first song, you're on the Titanic. It's a disaster, but that's why I ended up saying is, you know what? I didn't have the money to buy a PA, the recording thing. I like to control environment, so people take a different path. But anyway, so that's why I was lucky to meet Jim and Tom and Rick, because they really had it going on, and it was easy to see back in the day is that, David talks about it in the book, they built their own 8-channel mixers, things like that it made life nice. I mean, they really were ahead of the game.
Yeah, I've got Tony from Whiplash on the doc talking about Morrisound was the only studio that was built the ground up as a studio. Everything else was tapped onto an old bar or something like that. This was a brick and mortar. Everything was about the music.
It was. They built it from the ground up. They did it, no doubt.
So you mentioned that metal in this period and death metal in this period is not very cool. It's definitely underground. So where's your wife fit into this? Because her husband's going off and doing this really uncool thing for 10 years. Was she always like, "Well, you got to do what you got to do"?
Oh, my wife. Sorry, I missed that. My wife?
Yeah. How does she perceive this all the way through? Is she a metal chick, or is she like, "What the fuck is my husband doing for 16 hours a day"?
No, my wife's not a metal chick. I mean, she likes music, but she just knew I liked it, and so yeah. I mean, it did take a strain, right? There's no doubt about that, because I was gone for a long time, and at the end, David talks about it in the book. That's one of the reasons why I said, "Fuck it, I'm done, and I'm going to go on and have regular life, kids, and stuff like that," because it does take a strain working that many hours. But no, she, my wife is the best, and I love her, and we're still happily married, and but it was a lot, and I mean, when you're young, though, I guess, I mean, working 16 hours, 15 hours, 7 days a week isn't that big a deal, but you do it for 10, 12 years, and it's not so good as, you know what I mean? And the other thing too is David mentions in the book, is the scene gets up, and I say this, and some of the bands maybe will be disappointed, but the scene gets tired. It's like any music scene, right? That it's great in the beginning, and then everything starts to feed off itself, and it's repetitive, and so and that it is just what it is. So that's why, like I said, I was lucky to be a part of it, but everything comes to an end.
Yeah,
Yeah. Have you got a particular Spinal Tap moment at Morris Sound that you can share? Drummer turns up without a kit. There's only one band that turns up, blah, blah, blah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'll think for a second. I'll talk for a second.
It's all right. Take your time. I can edit the space out.
No, I mean, David, what we talk about who used Marquez? Some one of the bands had a bad kit. And
Demented
Marquez,
Ted.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guy from Demented Ted showed up, and his kit was so bad that he did a few. You started setting up his kit. He played through it once, and I think you stopped him dead in his tracks. And Alex Marquez of Malevolent Solstice fame, usually left his kit at the studio. Scott would throw some money his way, and so that's what they ended up using.
Yeah. So, yeah. Right. So yes, absolutely. Thanks, David. Yeah. But, like I said, is a lot of times back in the day, kids, but it goes back to the point is, Jim, I guess to say this is we were all just winging it. I mean, I knew from what Jim and Tom and Rick had taught me and stuff about good drums or getting good equipment. But at the same time is most of the guys didn't have much experience, and it's not to diss on them or anything because they were all 18 years old or something, right? I mean, and it's not like today where you can watch a YouTube video or TikTok and somebody can show you something. We were all just figuring it out on our own. But there was quite a few days where guys showed up with bad equipment. And I mean, Tom, we had Thoroughbred Music, which Elliot owned, who was always very good to the studio and let us get equipment. But yes, there were many days when, people showed up with not such good equipment. And at the same time, it was difficult for me. That's why, like, some people gave me a lot of shit about, like, say, this guitar sounds no good or whatever it is. I didn't have a bank, and I'm not making any excuses. Things are different today. I didn't have a bank of plugins, right? I could go to a music store. I could get as many pedals. I could get as many amps, cabinets with different configurations of 25-watt Celestians, 35-watt Randalls, whatever anybody said, this sounds better, and try them. But you were just figuring it out on your own, and some days were better than others. So, yes, it's a good question, Jim. There were a lot of Spinal Tap moments.
This is, I guess, addressed to both of you in your respective fields. But what would you regard as the biggest pitfall of the music industry?
Go ahead, Dave.
Greed, right? That's probably it. There are people out there just to make a quick buck who are interested in commerce and not art. That is probably, and Jim, I'm sure you're dealing with that with your documentary, and Scott dealt with it all the time.
Yep.
Scott worked, and he can speak up too. Scott worked insane hours and worked on some highly influential records that sold well, and didn't make a lot of money out of it because it's just how the money flow was set up. So greed is always the downfall, unfortunately. If people did it for the sake of creativity and just to put cool stuff out, might be a different story. But it sucks to say, even in metal, even our beloved scene that exists, and gotta fight through it somehow.
As your fellow countryman, Jazz Coleman from Killing Joke said, money is not our God. But unfortunately, for most people, as David said, in the record industry, money is their God. And I'll just give you what David said sums it all up perfectly. There's not much to add but, I got paid just a lump sum, which is fine. The two records that I was given points on, I gave them back, Cannibal Corpse and Deicide, because the bands would come in, second album, third album, they'd tell us they're still not making any money. They're cross-collateralized is the word. And I was like, who the fuck am I to get more money? Or when you prorated across members of the band, why should I get more money? Or, I mean, I think I got like $100 off a Cannibal Corpse record one time. But still, when those guys don't have any money, why should I get that money? Why should I make more than them? They wrote the songs. If it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have a job. So I agree, greed, and but I guess that's the record label money, and they feel that they put up that money and made these bands. But I disagree, and like I said, money is not our god. So.
Yeah. What's the hardest time you've ever laughed? Or time you've laughed the hardest? Is that better English?
There you go.
Say that again. I missed that. I'm sorry.
Can you name a time that you've? Oh man, I'm losing the English on it now. What's the time that you've laughed the hardest? When is there a thing or something that happened that made you laugh the hardest you've ever laughed in your life? Again, to both of you.
Oh,
wow, that's a good one.
I mean,
some guys told some pretty funny stories.
Yeah, I mean, well, I remember like Jason Blackowitz from Malevolent Creation. He had a bunch of these crazy tattoos on his arm, and they looked like jailhouse tattoos, right? They weren't all like cool looking fancy tattoos. And he's telling the story of how he partied too much one night and he woke up and his buddies had tattooed him. And that was pretty funny because it was like, he said, well, yeah, I started scrubbing my arm and they didn't come off and stuff. And then I remember like with Exhorder, Kyle, they called me up when they came down and they were like, hey, Kyle's in jail. And I was like, what? Kyle's super cool. He's not like criminal, kind of bad. I mean, we all get into little problems in life. And so there was a street sign by the studio, and I forget if it was his name or Thomas
it was his
Avenue.
last name. Yeah, it was his last name.
Thank you, David. Yeah. And so it was on the ground or something. So he picked it up, and a cop happened to drive by and pick him up and, take him to jail for stealing the street sign. So I had to go down there and whatever. We just paid the $100 to get him out. But it was like, I'm not laughing. It was funny as hell because it was like, what? How the hell do you, it's not like you ripped the sign off the pole, right? You just took it or whatever. It was on the ground. That was funny. And anyway, but, just, a lot of the interactions between the guys, I remember Cerrito and Hobbs from Suffocation arguing about guitar tones, giving each other shit. And, you just kind of have to be there to see it. But, yeah, but we always had, playing the Cannibal guys and Steve Heritage from Assuck. We used to play Madden hockey all the time and wrap around. Those guys were big Buffalo Sabres fans, and they would just play hockey forever in the lounge and just laughing, rolling on the floor, beating each other, like betting money, and it was a good time. So. But
how about yourself, David?
Ooh, there were a lot of funny things that Scott shared with the book. The Kyle Thomas thing was really good. Jay Black also had a good story. Jason Black also shared a good story of him running into Yngwie at Criteria Studios after Yngwie made a number 2 in the studio and called him like butt nut or something like that. That made me laugh really hard because you could picture Yngwie. You could picture Yngwie doing that. Luke LeMay, who, Jim, I don't know if you've spoken with yet, from Gorguts, who's just a great guy, shared the story of how they had to trick Canadian Customs to get into the United States by posing as tourists here so they could get through without being sent back. I laughed really hard with that. Just the way Luke delivered the story was really good. Yeah, those were all some of the really funny moments during the book.
No, no, very good. Now on the complete opposite end, have either of you ever seen a ghost or have a gnarly ghost story as it is October?
Mm.
I haven't, Scott. Not to my knowledge. I don't know if you've seen anything in
No, I'm an
Florida.
atheist. I don't really believe in any mystical stuff. Sorry, buddy, but nah, I haven't seen
All
any
right.
ghosts.
I just had Count Chocula cereal, which has ghosts in it. You know, marshmallow ghosts. My daughter wanted to buy it, so that we had that. So maybe that counts for something.
Now, to wrap up, I'm going to do something very tedious, but I promise you, Scott, this is the thing. This is the answer to this question, and the discussion that's going to follow is the thing that I'm going to plaster on social media with the
Oh, I'm
intention
excited.
that you never have to answer this question again. That's the
Mm.
point of this. Would you
Okay.
ever, are you ever going to consider coming back to producing?
No, and I'll tell
Excellent.
you why. We talk about it in the book with Tell the Dirt, right? I mean, listen, I would love to, and I tried to with Tell the Dirt. And one is, I'm just being honest. I could sit around and probably be a producer and give you some ideas, a band, about what I think is good, bad, songwriting, sounds, etc. I do not, even though I'm a technologist in my day job, I'm not a technologist in the audio world. And I think the other thing is that, to be honest, is my, and we talked about it in the beginning, is my time has passed, right? The beauty of me, if there is any, in my smiling face, is that in the beginning, we were all winging it. Nowadays, the kids aren't winging it. They all know the deal. They all know the drill. They all have Pro Tools. They all have plugins. They can make everything sound much better than I ever did. So there is no need for Scott Burns, right? And I had fun and it was great, but really is there's nothing I can add to any band. Like when I saw Hobbs, David talks about it in the book in the Death to All tour. Uh, Suffocation opened up. That album, that 2017 album, the last one he did. I know they got a new single out and stuff, but one of the last albums. Like, it sounds better than the stuff I've done, and he does that with the Obituary guy up in
Joe
New York.
Cicada.
Thank you, Joe Scott. All these guys. There's no need. I had a place and time, and that's it, right? But there's nothing I can bring to the table anymore that you can't figure out on your own. Because, like I said, these kids have had 20 years of learning from these bands. And the other last thing I'll just say, 10 seconds, is it's a testament to these bands that they're still around. It's not about me, it's about the bands. And they're still around. Deicide, Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Exhort, all these bands are still doing well. Suffocation. I mean, whoever I've forgotten, I don't mean, but saying is cynic guys, atheist guys, Till the Dirt. All of them, they're still around making records. They're not making records with Scott Burns, so they must be doing something right. So I had a good time, and that's it. So thank you.
I'm going to articulate that a little bit because some people are going to come back and think you're being dejected, and it's like no. The barrier to entry has never been lower, but that's not the point. The point is Scott Burns is an innovator and a problem solver. There are no problems left to be solved. It's not. Yeah. I mean, and the thing is though, Scott, there's nothing stopping you from coming back and doing it as a hobby, except the fact that you'd have to manage everyone's expectations. And that's just like an exercise in futility, especially with respect, a man who just wants to do the job, go home and crack open a beer and watch what's the sports team you like.
The Rays. But no, I get that's fine, Jim. But I will say this. I'll say this as a challenge to any new engineer. And some of you guys will just tell me to go fuck myself. Figure out a way to make cymbals sound good on the new records. Everybody's kick drums and snares, they all sound killer. But your drum sounds are unrealistic. And you guys all may like that. but they don't sound like real records. They sound better than my records, don't get me wrong, but they don't sound like a drummer sitting there. So you guys figure that out. Thank you.
Lads, brilliant. That's it. Is there any other comments you want to make, David or Scott? Is there anything you want to add in there?
No, there's nothing to add after that. I think Scott did his mic drop, his drum mic drop there.
I just mean.
Yeah.